everybody. Zach Elliott at Feel Free to Argue. Hopefully you all have been doing okay without me. By way of an explanation of why I've been gone so long, basically it gets down to the fact that I'm practically computer illiterate and something happened where I couldn't get into my YouTube page. And that would have been the case for most of the time. I got back into it about 2.5 weeks ago, and basically since then, well, I've been dealing with having a new computer and kind of getting it up to speed, but also been trying to figure out what I want to talk about. I've been kind of out of this vlogging game for a while, and it's not like there isn't anything to talk about. Certainly the world is falling apart, but I kind of went back to like one of the things that got me upset originally. The reason why I set up my YouTube channel was about what the U.S. was doing in Iraq, and I kind of just saw another report that made me think about that again. So I want to talk a little bit about the recent Guardian report that came out, and talk about it on several different levels. First, talk a little bit about the history, then talk about, what is and isn't systemic about the particular U.S. actions in Iraq, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about Bradley Manning. First, talk about this report. It was on Democracy Now! I'm still watching that, and it was by a woman named Maggie O'Kane, who works for The Guardian, and she's got some serious credentials. She's been British Journalist of the Year, Foreign Correspondent of the Year, and they've just basically done a report running down Carl Steele, who was in El Salvador and then later in Iraq, and basically what he was in charge of doing was setting up what turned into torture slash death squads, Shia torture slash death squads, mostly around 2004. And what this report really gets into is looking at Steele's past and how involved he was in what was going on in El Salvador, and then seeing how he was tapped to basically do the exact same thing in Iraq. And he was a confidant of David Petraeus. Once again, more evidence that the worst thing that Petraeus did was not sleep with his biographer, but also was a confidant of Donald Rumsfeld. I guess apparently Donald Rumsfeld contacted him directly because they wanted his expertise a la what he did in El Salvador in Iraq. And there was this wonderful segment actually in the Democracy Now! Segment where they were interviewing this woman, where they showed Donald Rumsfeld fielding, or rather not fielding, a question from a reporter, talking about these allegations, that these forces that we were setting up in Iraq were essentially turning into El Salvador-style death squads. And Rumsfeld just basically says, well, I have no specific information. No information has come to me. I can't really comment on this because I don't really have any relevant facts. And it was the worst kind of bald-faced bullshit, considering that it's Donald Rumsfeld. I guess that was sort of a specialty of his. But I mean, there was the thing they showed immediately after this Rumsfeld interview was a memo that had been sent by Steele to Rumsfeld significantly earlier, and which basically detailed out all of the abuse, basically what those people were doing. And let's start looking at this, because I think the important thing about this is what was and wasn't systemic. And I think the U.S. military, is very successfully put across this idea that anything that went wrong, any kind of torture that occurred, was unauthorized, it wasn't coming from the top, it was just a few bad apples, and they just kind of pinned it on a lot of low-level people. And I think that one of the things that this report really details out is how systemic this effort was, how detailed it was, how intentional it was. So all of this stuff that we are just kind of holding our hands up and saying, well, we're not exactly sure why the violence is going up, and oh yeah, we've heard these reports, but they're unconfirmed. We knew everything about it. We knew everything about all of this stuff that was going on. Which brings me to another level of systemic activity, which is that the journalistic failure to deal with this in any kind of credible and serious way. One of the things that Maggie O'Kane pointed out was that this report has been shown in lots of different places already, and it's been picked up and optioned by probably half the countries in Europe at this point. So we as Americans may not know that this is what we're up to, but everybody else knows that this is what we're up to. Everybody else has their ideas about us, framed by their knowledge of this. So this is perhaps the answer to the question, that stupid question, the next time it's asked, why do they hate us? This is just another example of why they hate us. But we don't know about that because, as Maggie pointed out, no one in the United States, aside from Democracy Now!, has showed any interest in that. And Democracy Now! Is hardly the mainstream media here. So if you see something on Democracy Now!, it's probably pretty safe to assume that maybe 1 to 2% of the U.S. population knows about it. And the final thing I wanted to talk about, so I want to spend a little time talking about Bradley Manning in the sense that she points out that this report, this really important report, this highly detailed report, does not happen without Bradley Manning. And that's the first point I want to make about Bradley Manning. The second point I want to make about Bradley Manning is the fact that how we have treated him, how the U.S. government has treated Bradley Manning at this point, has already chilled out people's desire to talk about these kinds of things. So she was talking specifically about trying to get, because it's easy to, track down the people who were in these units. You can get the information, you can find out who the people were who were involved in these units, you can go to their house, you can ask them questions, but you can't get answers from them. Why? Because they've seen how Bradley Manning has been treated. And even if what they're doing is more okay, safer, more authorized, there's a chilling effect. They don't even want to take the chance of talking to a journalist lest they turn, the same thing happens to them that happened to Bradley Manning. So this will further increase the ignorance of the American population about these things that are being done in our name. But I think that's all I have for you this morning. On my birthday, I turned 50. As I've been putting it to people, despite 50 years of trying to kill myself, I have failed, and therefore I am 50. But anyway, this is Zach Elliott, and even though there's been a significant break, you guys know what the routine is. You can feel free to argue, even if it doesn't say that on my account anymore. I think some people will have me listed as Zach Elliott now. But anyway, whether it says Zach Elliott or feel free to argue, you can feel free to argue. Have a good day, everyone.